I grew up in a small, isolated village near Vladivostok, a place so far removed from the rest of the world that, even now, I sometimes wonder if it was real at all. It wasn't on any map that I've ever seen, and to this day I can't find a single trace of it. The village sat nestled between dense forests and rolling hills, completely cut off from the bustling cities and modern life. Even as a child, I knew there was something odd about it. The village itself had an unsettling charm. The houses were built in strange, mismatched styles. Some looked like they'd been standing for centuries, their wooden beams warped and twisted, while others seemed hastily constructed, almost as if they were meant to hide something beneath. There was no sense of uniformity, no cohesion, like a patchwork of different worlds stitched together. But it wasn't just the buildings that felt off, it was the silence. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but oppressive. Even on the busiest days, when the villagers would gather in the square, there was an unspoken rule that kept conversations to a whisper. No one ever raised their voice, and when someone did, it was met with nervous glances and hurried retreats. It was as if the very air carried secrets, and no one wanted to disturb whatever lurked just beneath the surface. I remember the people too. They were kind enough, at least on the surface, but distant. They kept to themselves, offering smiles that never quite reached their eyes. I always felt like they were hiding something. They'd watch from behind curtains as you passed by, their eyes following you, but when you looked back, the curtains would snap shut. No one ever seemed to leave the village, and no one ever came to visit. The strangest part, though, was how little anyone ever spoke about the outside world. It was as if the village existed in its own bubble, untouched by time. We had no radio, no television, and the rare times I heard anyone mention a city or a town beyond the forest, it was in hushed, almost reverent tones, as if they were talking about a place they'd only dreamed of. Looking back, I suppose I should have realized sooner that something wasn't right. But as a child, I just thought that was the way things were. That eerie quiet, those odd stares, the strange customs we followed without question, they were all I had ever known. As I grew older, the strangeness of the village became harder to ignore. It started small, just things that, at first, I brushed off as quirks or coincidences. I'd walk down the dirt paths between the houses and hear faint whispers coming from inside. The voices would be low and hurried, almost frantic, but the moment I got close enough to listen, they'd stop. I'd stand there, confused, straining to catch a word, but all I'd hear was that oppressive silence creeping back in, filling the air like a heavy fog. The villagers, too, started to seem different. I remember passing by the same faces every day, faces I had grown up around, people I thought I knew. But as I got older, those familiar faces became masks. They would stand in their doorways or in the fields, staring off into the distance, their eyes unfocused, almost like they were in a trance. Sometimes I'd wave or call out to them, but they wouldn't respond. They'd just stand there, unmoving for what felt like hours, until they blinked and went back to whatever they were doing as if nothing had happened. Then there were the nights. At night, the village transformed into something even more unsettling. The air grew colder, and the stillness became sharper, more menacing. I'd often hear the creak of footsteps outside my window, or the soft murmur of voices too faint to understand. Once, when I couldn't sleep, I peeked through the curtains and saw a group of villagers standing in the middle of the square, their backs to me, motionless. They didn't speak, they didn't move, they just stood there, staring at something I couldn't see. When I blinked, they were gone. Some of our neighbors would disappear for days at a time. Families that lived just down the road would suddenly be absent, their houses dark and quiet. No one talked about it. No one ever asked where they went. And then, just as suddenly, they'd return, acting as if they'd never left. I'd see them at the market or walking along the path, smiling their hollow smiles, pretending everything was normal. But their eyes looked haunted, like they'd seen something terrible but were forbidden from speaking about it. And then there was the feeling, the constant gnawing sensation that I was being watched. It didn't matter if I was alone in my room, walking through the woods, or even sitting with my family. I could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes following my every move. Sometimes I'd spin around, expecting to catch someone there, only to be met with empty air. But the feeling never left. It was always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting. I tried to talk to my parents about it once. I remember asking my mother if she ever felt like something was watching us. Her face went pale, and she shushed me immediately, glancing around as if someone might hear. She told me not to talk about such things, not to ask questions. I should have pressed her, but the fear in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Whatever was happening in that village, whatever darkness hid behind those cold stares and whispered conversations, it wasn't something I was meant to understand. But I couldn't shake it. The village, the people, it all felt wrong, like I was living inside a dream that was slowly turning into a nightmare. And the older I got, the harder it became to pretend that everything was normal. There was a part of the village that everyone avoided, a place we were warned never to go. It was on the outskirts, where the village tapered off into a thick, overgrown forest. I remember, even as a child, being told by my parents, by the older villagers, that nothing good ever came from wandering too far in that direction. The forest was dense, dark, and alive with shadows that seemed to move even in broad daylight. And beyond that forest, there were the abandoned houses, crumbling remnants of something older, forgotten, and best left that way. I was told to stay away, but of course, the more they told me not to, the more I felt drawn to it. As I grew older, the warnings became almost like a challenge. What were they so afraid of? Why did no one ever talk about the area past the village as if it didn't exist? The questions gnawed at me until I couldn't ignore them anymore. One afternoon, when the village was quiet and the usual oppressive stillness hung in the air, I decided to go. I slipped away, careful not to attract attention, and headed toward the forbidden area. The path was overgrown, almost like it hadn't been used in years, but the deeper I went, the more I felt like something, or someone, had been there before me. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was there, faint and sour, like damp earth mixed with something rotten. The trees grew thicker as I ventured deeper, their branches twisting unnaturally, blocking out most of the sunlight. Everything around me seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, and for the first time, I began to wonder if maybe the villagers were right. Maybe I wasn't supposed to be here. But it was too late to turn back. The curiosity that had burned inside me for years wouldn't let me leave now, not without answers. I soon found the first signs that something was very wrong. Scattered among the trees were bones, small at first, maybe from animals, but as I went farther they became larger, more unsettling. Some were bleached white by the sun, while others looked fresher, like they had been left there recently. But it wasn't just the bones. The trees themselves were scarred, their bark carved with strange symbols I didn't recognize. They were crude, almost primitive, but they radiated a sense of menace. I ran my fingers over one of the carvings and a shiver ran down my spine. As I walked further, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of it there was a pit. It wasn't large, but it was deep, far deeper than it should have been. I peered over the edge, expecting to see the bottom, but there was only darkness, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. I dropped a stone in, waiting for the sound of it hitting the bottom, but there was nothing. No hecho, no tuve. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels like it's swallowing you whole. Around the pit were more of those symbols, this time drawn in what looked like ash or maybe something worse. And scattered nearby were bones, these ones arranged in patterns like they were part of some ritual. I knelt down to get a closer look and saw what looked like dried blood smeared across the stones. I couldn't tell how old it was, but the sight of it made my stomach turn. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into that pit, feeling the weight of the forest around me. I could feel eyes on me watching from the shadows, though I saw no one. It was as if the village itself, the thing that had been hiding behind the whispers, the empty stares, the oppressive silence, was here waiting. I should have run. I should have left that place and never looked back. But I didn't. Instead, I reached out toward one of the symbols, my hand trembling as I traced its jagged lines. And in that moment, I felt something shift in the air. Something dark, something ancient, something that had been waiting for someone like me to come too close. It was then I realized why we were told never to come here. It wasn't just fear. It was a warning. And I had just ignored it. After that day in the forbidden area, everything changed. It was subtle at first, like the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The villagers, who had always been distant and cold, now seemed to avoid me altogether. I could feel their eyes on me whenever I passed, but instead of the usual uneasy stares, there was something more, an edge of hostility. Even my parents acted differently, watching me with a quiet intensity, their faces tight with worry. I tried to act normal, pretending I hadn't seen anything in the forest, but they knew. They all knew. The whispers became louder. Conversations would stop the moment I entered a room, and people who had once at least smiled in passing now turned their backs on me. At first, I thought I could handle it, but the isolation started to wear me down. It was as if the village itself was closing in around me, suffocating me in its silence. My family was no different. My mother barely spoke to me, her eyes constantly flicking toward the window as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. My father, always a quiet man, became almost paranoid. He'd lock the doors early, triple-checking the locks, whispering under his breath. I overheard him arguing with my mother one night, something about keeping me safe, and the price we pay. I didn't understand what he meant, but the way his voice trembled sent chills down my spine. That's when the dreams started. They weren't like normal dreams, These felt too real, too vivid. Every night, I'd wake in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, and every time I'd see the same thing. Figures standing at the foot of my bed, shadowy and indistinct, but I could feel their presence, their eyes on me. They never moved, never came closer, but they whispered my name over and over again until I thought I'd go mad. I'd bolt upright, gasping for breath, but the room would be empty. The shadows would retreat into the corners, but I knew they were still there, waiting. I tried to push the dreams out of my mind, to convince myself they were just nightmares. But as the days passed, I started noticing other things. Small things at first, symbols scratched into the doorframe of our house, similar to the ones I'd seen in the forest. Objects would go missing only to reappear in strange places. I'd hear faint chanting in the dead of night, coming from somewhere deep in the village, though no one ever spoke of it. I began to piece things together, bit by bit, from fragments of overheard conversations and old, forgotten stories. There were whispers of a cult, something ancient that had existed in the village long before my time. It explained the isolation, the secrecy, the strange customs. The village wasn't just cut off from the world by distance, it was cut off by choice. Bound to something far older, far darker than I had ever imagined. I found old books hidden in the attic, pages filled with strange symbols and rituals. The language was foreign, something I couldn't read, but the images told me enough. Sacrifices, offerings. Something buried deep beneath the village, something the people had been worshipping or perhaps appeasing for generations. The more I learned, the more the dreams intensified. The figures in the shadows became more distinct, and their whispers grew louder, almost desperate. I confronted my parents about it one evening, demanding to know the truth. My mother broke down in tears, begging me to stop asking questions, telling me it was for my own good. But my father, he just stared at me, his eyes hollow, defeated. "It's always been this way," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "We keep the peace. We do what needs to be done. And now it's your turn." That night I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figures, heard the chanting, felt the weight of their eyes on me. Something was coming. Something that had been waiting, watching, and now I had become part of it. The village wasn't just strange. It was cursed, and I was trapped inside its secret. The moment I realized I had to leave, it was already too late. The village was closing in around me, suffocating me under the weight of its secrets. Whatever was hunting me, it wasn't just the villagers. There was something darker, something ancient, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment to claim me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched at every moment. My dreams had bled into reality, and now, those shadowy figures no longer just haunted my nights. I'd see them out of the corner of my eye during the day, dark, faceless shapes flitting between the trees, standing motionless in the distance, always watching, always waiting. The villagers themselves became more aggressive, their hollow stares now full of menace. No one spoke to me anymore, but they didn't need to. Their silence was suffocating, a warning that I was running out of time. One night, after weeks of sleepless terror, I made my decision. I couldn't stay. Whatever the village wanted from me, whatever role I was meant to play in their dark rituals, I wasn't going to be a part of it. I packed what little I could carry, my hands shaking, my mind racing with the sound of those endless whispers. I had to escape. I didn't care where I went as long as it was far away from here. That night, the village was eerily quiet, as if it knew. I could feel it in the air, a tension, a stillness that made every step feel like it echoed through the entire place. I waited until the moon was high, casting long shadows over the twisted houses, before slipping out. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but I had no choice. It was my only way out. As I stepped into the trees, I felt it, a presence behind me. At first, it was just a faint feeling like the ones I had felt for so long. But then I heard them, the soft shuffle of footsteps, the crack of twigs underfoot. I didn't dare look back. I knew what I'd see. Those shadowy figures, the ones from my nightmares, had come for me. I ran. The forest was a blur of branches and darkness as I tore through it, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind me I could hear them, whispers, low and urgent voices calling my name, urging me to stop, to turn back. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating, but it was the only thing keeping me moving. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. All I knew was that if I stopped, if I looked back, I'd be lost forever. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches grabbing at my clothes, tearing at my skin. The forest was endless, and the shadows followed me everywhere. I could feel them getting closer, their presence like a cold breath on the back of my neck. I stumbled, nearly falling, but I forced myself to keep going. I had to get out. I had to survive. Then I saw it, A break in the trees, the faintest hint of dawn on the horizon. My legs were burning, my lungs screaming for air, but the sight of that faint light gave me the strength I needed. I pushed myself harder, desperate to escape the darkness behind me. Finally, I broke through the tree line, the village fading behind me into the distance. I didn't stop running until the sun had fully risen, bathing the landscape in a warmth I hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. Only then did I dare to stop and look back. There was nothing. No shadows, no figures, no village. Just an empty stretch of forest, as if the place had never existed. But I knew better. It was there, lurking, hidden from the world, waiting for its next victim. Years have passed since that night, and I've tried to move on. I've lived in cities, surrounded by people, far from the isolation of that cursed place. But no matter how far I go, I can't forget. The village is gone, erased from maps, forgotten by history as if it had never been. But it haunts me still. I see it sometimes in the dead of night when I wake from another nightmare. I'll feel that same oppressive silence, hear the whispers that never quite leave my mind. And I'll know deep down that it's still out there waiting. I escaped the village, but I never truly left it. And I fear one day it will find me again.